Why don't we get started? Good evening, everyone. My name is Behnam Dayanim, and I am the treasurer and member of the executive committee of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. The JCRC serves as the political affairs and community relations arm of the organized Jewish community in our nation's capital. We represent more than 100 organizations and synagogues throughout the region. A key component of our work is advocating and mobilizing voices against anti-Semitism, racism, anti-LGBTQ, and other forms of hate. We do this in a number of ways. Through legislative advocacy, we work to strengthen hate crimes laws, to give law enforcement more tools to apprehend and prosecute, and to make Holocaust education mandatory. We also engage in intergroup and interfaith work. The JCRC works on a daily basis with a wide range of community organizations and organizers in that way, pursuing legislative, legal, educational, and communal responses. We are a leading participant in the Montgomery County Faith Community Advisory Council, the Fairfax County Interfaith Committee, and the Interfaith Council of Metropolitan Washington, just to name a few, and are strong believers in the power of community and of coalitions to fight bias and bigotry. Grassroots mobilization is key to our work as well. We recently distributed our racial justice toolkit to synagogues and agencies. You can find it on our website, jccouncil.org, and I encourage each of you to spend some time looking through the resources we provide there. Finally, we have educational outreach initiatives, working in the schools to educate kids and ensure greater mutual respect and understanding, as well as providing Holocaust education and awareness to kids and adults alike. On behalf of JCRC, I want to thank all of our co-sponsors this evening, who are too numerous to name, but can be found on our website and in the chat log. I do want to highlight that tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Anti-Defamation League, Integrity First America, the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, and many of our local synagogues and Jewish agencies, as well as the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the Southern Poverty Law Center, AJC Fairfax, and the NAACP Fairfax. On a personal level, this evening's events are doubly meaningful to me. I vividly recall, as I'm sure others on this call do as well, watching appalled at a group of Americans appropriating the tropes of Nazism, which our country fought so hard to defeat, at a time still within the lifetimes of some of our fellow citizens. And the chill of fear I felt trickle down my spine at hearing chants of "the Jews will not replace us." I was born and raised in Virginia, and knowing that this was happening just a couple of hours from where I grew up, and really not much further from where I live today, made it all the more sobering. While I firmly believe that white supremacists, anti-Semites from across the political spectrum, and their fellow travelers do not reflect the majority of our great country, it is essential that they be taken seriously and confronted through all legal channels available to us. Integrity First for America does just that. The IFA is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to the pursuit of those who threaten long-standing principles of our democracy, including our country's commitment to civil rights and equal justice. So it is with both great sadness at the need and deep appreciation for their commitment to taking on this challenge that I welcome you all this evening to hear from IFA and its lawyers about their attempts to hold the white supremacists and neo-Nazis who visited violence in Charlottesville accountable for their actions. With that, to our introductions. First, Amy Spatelnik. Amy is Executive Director of Integrity First for America. Prior to joining IFA, she served as Communications Director and Senior Policy Advisor to the New York Attorney General, Communications Advisor and Spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and Communications Director in the New York State Senate. She has also worked on a number of federal, state, and local campaigns and advocacy organizations. Amy frequently appears in national media. She is a Truman National Security Project Partner, a New Leaders Council faculty member, a Woman in Power Fellow at the 92nd Street Y, and a City and State 40 Under 40 Rising Star. Next, Roberta Kaplan. Robbie is founding partner at Kaplan, Hecker & Fink. A formidable litigator with decades of experience in both commercial and civil rights litigation, she is perhaps best known for representing Edith Windsor in the landmark case United States v. Windsor, in which the Supreme Court held that a key provision of the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional, landing the first major victory in the battle for marriage equality. Robbie is the author of Then Comes Marriage, U.S. v. Windsor, and The Defeat of DOMA, chosen by the LA Times and Ms. Magazine as one of the top 10 books of 2015. Although Robbie has received numerous awards, including the New York Law Journal Lifetime Achievement Award and the Columbia Law School Medal of Excellence, I understand that she is probably most proud of receiving an honorary doctorate from the Jewish Theological Seminary. Third, Karen Dunn. Karen is a partner at Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison, a major international law firm. Karen is widely recognized as one of the country's top trial lawyers and experts in crisis management, helping her clients solve their biggest problems both in and out of the courtroom. As the American Lawyer noted when naming Karen a 2017 Litigator of the Year, she specializes in high-stakes, high-profile, hard-fought cases. Karen previously served in all three branches of government as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, associate White House counsel under President Obama, communications director to then Senator Hillary Clinton, and law clerk to Judge Merrick Garland of the D.C. Circuit and Justice Stephen Breyer of the Supreme Court. She's received numerous awards for her litigation and trial work, and has been named one of Elle Magazine's most compelling women in Washington, D.C. And finally, our moderator this evening, Eric Ward, Executive Director of the Western States Center. Eric is a national expert on the relationship between hate violence and democratic institutions, governance, and inclusive societies. Originally from Los Angeles, Eric began his civil rights work when the white nationalist movement was engaged in violent paramilitary activity that sought to undermine democratic governance in the Pacific Northwest. As one of a handful of prominent leaders of color working to counter this new manifestation of organized hate, Eric successfully encouraged some violent neo-Nazi leaders to renounce racism and violence. Eric has been quoted and cited extensively by national media and is the author of the 2017 essay, Skin in the Game, How Anti-Semitism Animates White Nationalism. Eric was one of 8 leaders in countries ranging from the United States to Senegal to receive a new Executives Fund grant from the Open Society Foundations in 2018. And in 2019 was named a Fellow of the Rockwood Leadership Institute. He is also the recipient of the Peabody Facebook Futures Media Award, Arab American Association of New York Community Impact Award, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Award. I am clearly outclassed, but I am extremely excited to hear what our panelists will tell us. Before I turn it over to Eric, I just want to let people know that you can submit questions using the chat function on Zoom, and they will be shared with our moderator. So with that, Eric, please take it away.
Thank you so much. And I know we're going to be starting first with a short video, but I want to welcome everyone for joining us. We are going to have an amazing conversation on such an important topic. I also want to let folks know, due to COVID-19 and the pandemic, there will be unexpected background noise, perhaps from speakers, and we will acknowledge that when it happens, but we won't let it distract from the conversation that's happening this evening. And so let's start first with a segment. Amy, I think you may be getting that underway.
Yes, I will share my screen now and folks can watch directly, no need to do anything. There is a warning on the video, but I will reiterate it here. There are some disturbing images in the video, so I want to make sure folks know. And with that, let's get started.
Who's free? I'm free! Who's free? I'm free! Who's free? I'm free!
In Charlottesville. Stark displays of racism.
Trying to promote a car has rammed into a crowd.
Victims thrown in the air.
Act of domestic terror.
One woman dead, others chasing wounded.
10 of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop the violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences. But we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
Amy, Robbie, Karen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. For those who are watching, we want to bring you up to speed. 3 years ago, this August, neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended upon Charlottesville, Virginia for a weekend of violence. The violence was no accident. It was the results of months of planning, and it served as a hairbringer of the cycle of white supremacist violence that has followed, not only in the United States, but in New Zealand and also in Europe. We know in the United States now, white supremacists have been involved in the deaths of more Americans than any other political ideology over the last few years. Integrity First for America, in partnership with what I would call a world-class legal team, is uniquely taking on the neo-Nazis and hate groups at the center of this violent movement, holding them accountable in federal court for the violence they brought to Charlottesville in 2017. Taking on and taking down these violent extremists is critical, I believe, as they seem to exploit recent protests to spread discrimination, hate, fear, and violence. We also know that these hate groups often look to see if they will experience passive response or real civic leadership. And civic leadership means bringing both transparency and accountability in this moment. I wanted to ask you, Amy, to take us back to 2017 and describe for those listening what actually happened in Charlottesville and how this case came about.
Sure, I'll start and then I will pass it to Robbie and Karen, who can really tell the story of the case's origins. But I think it's so easy to forget that 3 years ago in an American city, neo-Nazis and white supremacists were so emboldened that they felt that they could attack that city and target people based on their race, religion, and willingness to defend others' rights. And so many of the images are so vivid. We saw some of them in the video we just showed. But first was the Tiki torch march on the University of Virginia, in which neo-Nazis in matching uniforms, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us," "All lives matter," "Blood and soil," "This is our town now," ultimately surrounded a group of UVA students and other community members, kicked them, punched them, threw fuel and lit torches at them. As I know, we will dive into, one of our plaintiffs said he thought he was going to die that night, an African-American student. And then, of course, the next day, the violence continued. Instead, they marched military style on downtown Charlottesville, surrounding the local synagogue, where they stood outside chanting "Sieg Heil" with semi-automatic weapons, charging an interfaith line of clergy, including one of our plaintiffs, Reverend Seth Wispaway. And ultimately, as we all know too well, plowing a car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring many others, including our plaintiffs. And as Robbie and Karen will now describe, none of that was an accident. So I'll pass it to Robbie and to Karen to talk about the genesis of the case and how it came about.
So let me
Karen,
just oh, sorry, go ahead, Karen.
I was going to say, Karen and Robbie, as you start to tell this story, can you also share a little bit about how you became aware of what was happening in Charlottesville?
Sure. So Karen and I, who are very close friends, have been playing a bit of musical chairs, in the sense that I had been a partner of Paul Weiss, and I had just started my own law firm in July 2017. And I think the date that we moved into our offices was August 7th, 2017. We had about 6 employees. We were working on card tables and folding chairs. And that Monday, which must have been the 14th, I decided that we were going to, I mean, it was naive and stupid of me in retrospect, but I decided that we were going to order in pizza for lunch, and we were going to watch the press coverage of what had happened that weekend in Charlottesville. I said it was naive of me because even I hadn't anticipated the horrible images that I and my colleagues were going to see. And indeed, one of my colleagues got very upset, understandably so, watching what had happened. But as I was watching the horrible images and the events that had happened that weekend, I thought to myself, well, something needs to be done about this. At that point in time, our Attorney General was, I did not think someone who would focus, it was Jeff Sessions, would focus on this with the degree of attention that I thought it needed. And so I thought, well, can we do anything about it? And I immediately thought back to a case that my mentor, Paul Weiss, Marty London, had done years ago against, out in your neck of the woods, Eric, the trial was in Portland, against a group of violent anti-abortion protesters who had a website called the Nuremberg Files. And on that website, they would put the photographs, this is the early days of the internet, but they would put the photographs and the home addresses and other information about doctors who were performing abortions. And then as those doctors got hurt and one of them was killed, they would put red X's across their faces on the website. And Marty and another Paul Weiss partner, Maria Vullo, brought a case against under the Violence Against Women Act against those organizations. They got a huge verdict from a jury in Portland. It was appealed twice, but ultimately the verdict was sustained. And they then spent the next 5 to 10 years chasing those guys and making sure that whenever they got a job, their wages would be garnished. When they bought a home, there would be a lien put on the home. And while there, of course, is still violence in connection with anti-abortion protests, the degree of violence actually, excuse me, substantially decreased as a result of that case. So I thought to myself, can we do something like that here? And so I picked up the phone and I called a friend who I'm sure everyone on this, listening to this knows, the writer at Slate Magazine, Dahlia Lithwick, who covers the Supreme Court. I called Dahlia because, not because she's a great lawyer, which she is, but because I knew she lived in Charlottesville. And I said, look, I have this idea. What do you think? And she said, I think it's a great idea. We're actually right now moving to Brooklyn, but I think it's a great idea. Come down, I'll put you in touch with some folks and we'll go from there. And so within about, I think it was 48 to 72 hours, we were on a plane down to Charlottesville. I think it's fair to say that the town, which is really a beautiful college town, not a right-wing town at all, a really liberal, open-minded place with a large Jewish community for the size of the town, in a very large African-American community. They were in a state of shock. The white Mercedes vans, believe it or not, that many of the people who were involved in the violence used to come down to Charlottesville to travel around town, those vans were still driving around the streets, particularly in the African-American neighborhoods. And people were terrified. We met with a whole bunch of folks, many of whom ended up becoming our plaintiffs. Seth Wellesbele is certainly one of them. And then we came back to New York and we got a really good break, and that is a group of hackers known as Unicorn Riot actually hacked into the servers that were on a gaming platform known as Discord that the organizers of Charlottesville had used for many, many months leading up to Charlottesville. And they made it public. And so we kind of had many of their communications leading up to the events. I thought that was enough to bring a case. Karen can describe the case, but I knew I wasn't going to do it alone. So the next call I made was to my friend Karen Dunn saying, how'd you like to sue some KKK members and Nazis with me in Charlottesville?
That's great. Karen, talk to us now a little bit. You get a call from Robbie. You get a chance to start looking through some of these documents. What do you see? And talk to us a little bit about how you build the legal theory.
Sure. So first of all, I'm not even sure Robbie knew this when she called me, but in my past life, I was a prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia in the National Security Unit. Now I do trials for companies mostly, but we actually brought a case that had some echoes of this and was a conspiracy case against, essentially white supremacists who were using various technological means to coordinate with each other And, you know, that case was more of an incitement case, incitement to do violence. And I had also been one of the lawyers for the owner of Comet Pizza, who I'm sure many people here will remember was the place that was at the center of the conspiracy theory where, you know, my former boss, Hillary Clinton, and others were supposedly running, you know, a pedophile ring, and a guy who had heard this with, you know, very sincere intent traveled with his AR-15 to the restaurant in order to free the kids. And so in a way, this case is kind of at the nexus of that. You know, it combines the conspiracy theories and the use of this technology to rally an enormous number of people, you know, to a cause that, you know, is at its core quite violent. And so this is part of the work that I did as a prosecutor. And so when Robbie called me, you know, obviously, you know, when someone says you want to sue the Nazis, you obviously, you know, there's only one answer to that. So of course I said yes, and had been a long admirer of Robbie's in particular. But, you know, the case is, while it has echoes of what had come before, in particular in my legal work, it is really, it's a one-of-a-kind case, because while a lot of cases like this are at their core conspiracy cases, this is too, but the conspiracy here really is the very top leadership of the white supremacist and neo-Nazi movement, who many of whom were closely involved, and can be closely tied to the violence that occurred in Charlottesville 3 years ago. And so the core statute in the case is the Kkk Act. You know, fortunately, it's not an often used statute in this day and age, but really a conspiracy to do racially motivated violence is prohibited under this statute. So in a way, you know, it's sort of an unusual case because it's an unusual statute. But on the other hand, in federal court, as probably many lawyers who are listening to this will know, a conspiracy case is not unusual. And so here, our co-conspirators are really the leaders of this movement, who are bound together through their agreement to do acts together and towards planning them together. And as you said at the beginning, this was not an accident. The weekend's events, including and especially the violence and the provoking of violence with protesters, was planned. It was premeditated. And as Robbie said, we were very fortunate here. It's very unusual that the communications of the defendants would be released into the public so that we could put them in our complaint. And so the judge could see that when he ruled on the defendant's motion to dismiss in this case, denying that motion to dismiss based on that publicly released evidence, and allowing our case to go forward as it will ultimately to trial. So that's a little bit in a nutshell. And obviously it's, you know, there's a lot to say on the legal front, but that's the very high level overview.
Can you give one or two examples of things you've seen that show that there was pre-planning? What were a couple of things that really stood out?
Well, so we all have our favorite examples of this. So I'll give you mine, and then I'm sure Robbie and Amy can give theirs. But one thing I want to say, because there are a lot of people listening to this, so far, the most important thing to read in this case is our complaint, which is the only place so far that the entire story of what happened in Charlottesville and all of the planning is told, not just in words, but in pictures and in the defendant's own postings on the Discord platform where they plan this. And so I really encourage everybody to go to integrityfirstforamerica.org and download the complaint so you can see for yourself. It is arresting. It is staggering. You will not look at the world the same way after you read this complaint because of how well planned these events were. So the one that always stands out for me is there's a picture literally of a tractor running over people, which is referred to as the protester digester. And you know, that is an extreme version of what actually happened in Charlottesville, where, and this was discussed too by the defendants and the co-conspirators, where they discussed running over people with a vehicle. And so that is what happened in Charlottesville. And you know, frankly, you know, if you ever actually go to Charlottesville and you walk down what is now called Heather Heyer Way, you can see how narrow it is, that you can't even believe that there was a group of people and a car that fit into this space. So if you drive a car down this little road, you of course are going to do grievous injury to people, which is exactly what happened when James Field drove his car and then backed it up and drove it again through a group of people. So for me, that was the most graphic, but there's so many examples of this.
And talk a little bit, and I want to bring in Amy and Robbie a little bit. This violence that occurred in Charlottesville appeared to be planned, including providing excuses or defenses for the violence. Is that true? And I would like to ask this question. There's been a lot of denouncement about violence, but have you all also experienced threats as you move this case forward?
Let me talk about what they talked about leading up to the rally, and then Amy can talk about the threats, because we all have to live with them almost daily. So as per usual, I agree with everything Karen said, but I think what's astonishing to me is the kind of meticulous detail by which they plan these events. So Discord, which I mentioned, was previously a gaming platform, but it has mechanisms where you can have designated chat groups, and then in order to be admitted to one of the chat groups, you have to be admitted by a leader. So there were 2 leaders, both of whom are defendants in our case. And they had a large variety of chat groups. They were dedicated to things like transportation to Charlottesville, uniforms that people were going to wear, weaponry, leadership. A lot of discussion has already been mentioned about how to make it look like self-defense when you're really assaulting someone, and discussion of the laws in Virginia about self-defense and how to kind of make it look like Antifa was really attacking when in fact they were the ones who were doing the violence. The degree of planning and detail is extraordinary, and so is the degree of hate. I have to say it's kind of hard to shock me, because I've seen a lot of cases and done a lot of pretty tough things in my life. I was shocked here by the degree to which anti-Semitism seems to be the preeminent hatred. That's not to say they don't hate Black people, they do. They hate gay people, they hate immigrants and Muslim people. But almost every other word out of their mouths in these chats is about sending Jews to the ovens and recreating Auschwitz, with pictures of Jews that look like cartoons from Nazi Germany with noses out to here. At a certain point when we were preparing the case, you kind of have to have a sense of humor about it, because it's somewhat overwhelming. So one of the things that is actually evident here is, I'm sure everyone's familiar with Hannah Arendt and how she wrote about the banality of evil. And you see that in those chats too. I mean, they talked about things like, what is the best way to sew a swastika on a flag? What product should everyone be buying at Hobby Lobby to use with respect to their tiki torches? My favorite is there's kind of a very detailed discussion about what to bring for lunch, how that no one should use mayonnaise because it might go bad, and what was the best brand of gluten-free bread that they should use for their sandwiches. It's really, and a lot of this is in the complaint, although not all of it, and it's truly, as Karen said, astonishing.
As for the threats, look, I think in some ways they echo exactly what Robbie and Karen just described. The same hate that fueled what happened in Charlottesville is the hate that fuels their threats against us and our plaintiffs and our broader team. And I always like to know if my parents are watching when I answer this question, because maybe I won't go into such detail. But it is real. The security issues are real, and to be completely frank, the biggest line item in IFA's budget is security for that reason. That includes threats against Robbie, like our defendant Christopher Cantwell, known as the crying Nazi, who said a number of heinous things, but most notably last summer talked about, quote, all the fun he was going to have with Robbie when this is over. Notably, he's now in jail for threats he made against a fellow white nationalist on the same social media platform, Telegram, 2 days later. We know that these are people with extraordinary capacity for violence, and that the threat is not just their own capacity for violence, as we saw firsthand in Charlottesville, but their ability to rile their loyal followers to action, which in some ways is even scarier. And it's something that we at IFA deal with in terms of the emails and social media comments we get on a near daily basis. Certainly Robbie, Karen, and our legal team deal with it. Our plaintiffs deal with it. One of the plaintiffs in our suit is pseudonymous, and his name is not mentioned in the complaint because he's fearful for his life. And so our role at IFA is to ensure that this case is supported in every way, shape, and form. And for me, the most important way to support this case is to ensure our legal team, our plaintiffs, and everyone else who testifies at trial can do so feeling safe and secure, and not have to worry that these attempts by these Nazis and white supremacists to scare us away from taking action, scare us from holding them accountable, make sure that they can succeed in doing so.
So to give folks who are watching right now, the audience, a chance to be involved in the conversation, I wanted to let them know in about 6 minutes, we're going to start taking some questions from the audience. So this would be a good time to submit in either the question and answer button that you probably see above you. So I would just tell the audience to, if you have questions you would like me to try to get to please put them there. But Amy, Karen, and Robbie, let me ask a question. So you all have faced threats. Who are some of these defendants? Tell us a little bit about their background and what they might have been involved in Charlottesville on the day that Heather Heyer was killed.
Karen, the prosecutor, go ahead.
I was gonna let Robbie do this. She's good at this one.
So look, it's kind of the greatest hits of what's colloquially known, or what Richard Spencer calls the alt-right. Richard Spencer, who people probably know by name at least, is a defendant in the case. He was very involved in the weeks leading up to Charlottesville. The interesting thing about Charlottesville is it was perhaps the first time in modern times that successfully these disparate groups who generally don't get along so well, but they all share these vehement hatreds and this propensity and desire for violence. They all managed to unite for Charlottesville. That's why it's called Unite the Right. So we kind of, when we were deciding who to sue, we had these Discord chats, and we really wanted to go after the leadership. There obviously were many thousands of people there who were followers and who participated in the violence, but we wanted to sue the people responsible. So Richard Spencer, a guy by the name of Jason Kessler, who was kind of the local organizer and was one of the two people who had the ability to prove of people being in the various chat rooms. Chris Cantwell, who Amy mentioned, who, if people have seen the Vice video, he's also known as the crying Nazi, and is in jail right now in New Hampshire on threat charges, and was very violent during the events of Charlottesville South. In the Vice video, you see him with a huge number of guns and talking about beating people during those events. And of course, James Fields, who is the guy who actually drove the car. He will be spending the rest of his life in prison, but we believe, and we will show at trial, that what he did was no accident, that he was affiliated with these groups, he wore the uniforms of the groups, and that he did what they had been encouraging people to do for weeks leading up to the actual events on August 10th and 11th. Actually, excuse me, 11th and 12th.
And so just to echo what Robbie was explaining, these leaders and groups really are at the center of this movement. And it's so important to understand their connections, not just to what happened in Charlottesville and their central role there, and which is why they're named as the defendants in the suit, but their broader connections to the cycle of white supremacist and white nationalist violence that's followed. So we know, for example, that the Pittsburgh shooter who killed 11 at Tree of Life almost 2 years ago communicated on Gab, which is another right-wing hate site, with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack. We know that the Christchurch shooter, who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque a little over a year and a half ago in New Zealand, or about a year and a half ago in New Zealand, painted onto his gun a white power symbol that our defendant Matthew Heimbach popularized. And there's photos of Heimbach wearing that symbol on his shirt at various alt-right events. And then, of course, the Christchurch shooting was live streamed for the world to see on social media and inspired Poway and El Paso. We just marked the 1-year anniversary of the El Paso attack. And even now, during both coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter protests, we see the centrality of our defendants to the violence, the terror, and the disinformation that's been running rampant. During coronavirus, members of National Socialist Movement, which is one of our defendants, one member tried to bomb a hospital in Missouri that was treating coronavirus patients. Another one is the guy who held the quote, "Jews are the real plague" sign that made the rounds online in Columbus, Ohio. Similarly, during the Black Lives Matter protests, our defendants have been central to trying to sow tensions and worse. Identity Europa, one of our defendants, was behind a now viral tweet that claimed to be Antifa, urging violence in white neighborhoods. And of course, we've seen many try to replicate the tactics of Charlottesville, like the KKK leader who plowed his car into protesters in Richmond, an hour down the road from Charlottesville. And so over and over again, we see how central these individuals and groups are to the movement. And by taking them on in this suit, bankrupting and dismantling them through the large civil judgments we will win at trial this fall, this case will have ripple effects that go well beyond Charlottesville and have huge financial and legal and operational impacts on the broader white supremacist movement.
Thank you for that. And, you know, I wanted to ask one question before I go to a really good question from the audience. So just have the audience bear with me for a second. And also it's a good time to tell folks, if you were for more details on both the evidence and the case, to really take a look at Integrity for America's website, where I think that there is a very well done outline on the events that transpired in Charlottesville and the case. You know, often in kind of the public and media space, the actual plaintiffs, right, those who were victimized, their story is lost. You all have not done that, though. You all have worked really hard to lift up these stories. Tell us a little bit about the plaintiffs in this case.
Here.
Sure. Well, the plaintiffs are, you know, first of all, I think the most important thing to tell you about them is how brave they are in taking this on. I mean, it's one thing to say we want justice and we want accountability, and it's another thing to, you know, not just put your name on a lawsuit, but eventually have to testify, to be deposed, have to come to court and relive these awful events over and over and over again. And so our plaintiffs are a group of people who are, you know, Charlottesville residents who were injured either at the Friday night Torchlight rally. Some of those photos you saw in the introduction video, and then also Saturday during the car attack. And actually, I think you saw photos of a number of them in the video. They're, you know, the iconic photo that for a lot of people really captures what happened in Charlottesville is of James Field's car running into a crowd of protesters and a large African-American man being thrown over the back of the car. And so that's Marcus Martin. He's one of our plaintiffs. And he was injured, you know, physically and also, you know, psychologically and emotionally by those events. He had pushed his fiance, Marissa Blair, out of the way of the car, and she's also a plaintiff of ours. You know, there's a woman you saw in the video, Natalie Romero, you know, had blood like streaming down her face. She's one of our plaintiffs. And then also, I believe you saw a photo of Seth Wispole, who is a faith leader in Charlottesville. And he is the head of a group called Congregate, where he brings together people from different faiths to stand in, you know, really peaceful protest to what was going on. And so they and others are our plaintiffs. And, I think, I speak for Amy and Robbie and the entire legal team when I say that, really we are in awe of our clients in this case. This is a case where all we're going to do as lawyers is just go to a jury and tell them what happened. All you really need to do here is tell the facts and allow the plaintiffs to get on the stand and say what happened to them. And it is, moving is like a dramatic understatement to what it's like to listen to the folks who not just live through this, but live through the aftermath, who stay in Charlottesville and, have to live with the fear that this could happen to them again. I mean, just to be completely clear, like this event was called Charlottesville 2.0. And what that means is that there was a Charlottesville 1.0, which was a much more minor event, but based on the same principles. And that it was very much intended that there be a Charlottesville 3.0. And, these are all folks who live in this community and were really terrorized over time consistently by these events.
So then a quick follow-up question. And Robbie, I want to ask you this, and then Karen, I want to come back to you with a different question. So I'm going to ask you both these questions. So Robbie, there's a question from the audience. Is the U.S. Justice Department Civil Division playing any role in the lawsuit? Is this only a civil suit, or has there been a criminal case? So that's for you, Robbie. And then the question I wanted to ask you, Karen, is in terms of the vehicle attacks that happened in Charlottesville, it seemed to signal a new form of violence. We have learned and witnessed cars being used as a form of attack on civil protesters in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about how the tactics used in Charlottesville have mainstreamed? And so I'll let you think about that. And Robbie, I'll ask you the question again about the U.S. Justice Department Civil Division and if they are playing any role in this lawsuit.
Sure. So there have been criminal prosecutions of several of the participants in Charlottesville. As I said before, James Fields was convicted of murder, and he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Chris Cantwell was actually prosecuted in Virginia, was barred from the state of Virginia for a period of time, and is now being prosecuted by the federal authorities in New Hampshire. And there have been some prosecutions in other states of some of the groups that were affiliated with these individuals. But this is the only case that goes after kind of the broader conspiracy that took place in Charlottesville, that looks at all these groups and individuals as a whole. And to answer the question, we can only do that civilly. Karen and I right now do not have the power of prosecutors. We can't send anyone to prison. All we can do is sue them civilly. And so that's what this case is about, under a statute that, as Karen says, was passed in 1871 to prohibit racially motivated violence when the Klan was arising in the Deep South, basically to re-enslave the newly freed slave.
Let me just add, before I get to your question, which is an excellent question, let me just add something to what Robbie said, with which I very unsurprisingly completely agree. So it's funny, I had a law professor in law school who is also a former prosecutor. She used to lament losing her subpoena power, that you can't like open your drawer and just hand out subpoenas, which is something that you can do when you're a prosecutor. But, two things. While it's true we can only proceed civilly, we have already been successful in this case with the power of civil contempt. So unsurprisingly, our defendants are not so enamored with the rule of law, and that includes their discovery obligations, the obligation to give us information, devices, documents, and the things that we're entitled to under the law. And so we have moved against them to have them held in civil contempt. One of them actually went to jail and owes us, some amount of money in civil fines. And so I do think we are, within the bounds of the civil process, we really are trying to use every lever that we have to exert pressure on these folks. And that as Amy said, will include, civil judgments of money that will impact the organizations. The defendants themselves have said that they can't proceed with business as usual because this lawsuit is tying them up and harming them financially and otherwise. So I think that's one thing. And then the second thing is that this is an extremely ambitious case. And so Robbie is right. The government has not and will not bring this case. It is ambitious in scope. It is ambitious sort of in conception. But it does put pressure on the government to proceed criminally, because we are going to put in the public now evidence that is very damning. And that if you are the Department of Justice, you will have to take note that this was a conspiracy that is probably a criminal conspiracy in addition to being a civil conspiracy. And I think that is important and one of the goals here. The second thing, which is to answer your question, it's a great question. I think it's new and it's old. So on the one hand, it is completely traditional to use things that you have and weaponize them. And so, for a long time now, we've had experience with people who make, bombs in their kitchen. This is one thing that I was very aware of as a prosecutor in the national security space. I mean, this is kind of like the most tried and true thing in all humanity. You take what's at your disposal, and we're a country where people drove airplanes into a building. I mean, so driving your car into a protester is sort of both, of course, and also something that, we really haven't seen exactly like this in quite a long time, particularly in this extraordinarily brazen and premeditated manner. So I think it's both. I think, there's a raging debate in the country over what to classify as domestic terrorism. I think that's a worthy debate. And I think that these sorts of things are really part of that.
And it takes a lot of work, a lot of discipline, a lot of tenacity to build a legal case. You all have been working at it for a very long time. Tell us about the current status of the case. Where does it stand?
Yeah, so one might ask, why is it taking so long? Why haven't you gone to trial already? It's a question we ask ourselves almost every day. And the answer is kind of following up on what Karen said, dealing with defendants who have the maturity level of 10-year-olds maybe, and who have complete contempt for the law and for court orders, makes it, particularly in the civil system, makes it very hard to get documents. So it's really taken us 2 years to get these guys to turn over their phones and their laptops and their Facebook accounts and their texts, etc. We've heard all kinds of excuses. I think at least 3 phones, shockingly, miraculously dropped into the toilets and were, unable to have any data extracted from them. But in these past 2 years, we have managed to get a huge amount of data from them. Just, having them violate court order after court order after court order, to the point where at one point we actually had to put one of them, or the judge put one of them in jail for civil contempt because he just refused to comply with the discovery orders. But we finally did that. We have a lot more than we originally had from those hacks at the beginning. We have all the Discord chats now from Discord directly. And we've also managed to depose them all. So at this point, we are close to trial. There's a trial scheduled for October 26th. It's going to be a jury trial right now, at least. We all know the world that we live in. So we're hoping that we go forward at the end of October, but obviously, we have to think about the current situation with COVID as well.
Yeah, well, basically what we learned is that if you're a white supremacist, the odds that your phone gets dropped in the toilet is 90% more likely than if you're just a regular person.
Amazing how
it
that
is
happens.
true.
It's incredible. Really, what are the odds?
And there have been some individuals who have even taken the steps of renouncing organized white supremacy and their positions as pressure builds around the legal case? Is that accurate?
Well, there are two defendants who claim that they have left the white supremacist movement. Other defendants, as was alluded to earlier, have complained about the case's impact, including Richard Spencer in court the other week, complaining that the case is, quote, financially crippling, and saying that he's been deplatformed from a lot of sites and can't raise money, which is something that I think is worth noting. Deplatforming works. However, as you mentioned, a few of the defendants have claimed that they've left the movement. There is deep skepticism around that for a number of reasons, including the fact that these are people who were in the movement for decades, involved leading some of the most violent and bigoted neo-Nazi and white supremacist organizations in the country. And while I wholeheartedly believe that everyone deserves an opportunity to reform and repent, doing so in this case would mean fully cooperating with the litigation, cooperating with their discovery obligations, turning over the evidence to which our plaintiffs are entitled. And these defendants have not done so. They've both been sanctioned by the court, among other things. And so I think, you know, when we see it, maybe we'll start to believe it, but there's a lot of deep skepticism among counter-extremism experts. The SPLC did a blog post on these two defendants the other month, Matthew Heimbach and Jeff Scoop, that I would recommend to folks to check out, looking at their history and looking at some of the skepticism around their ability to, or rather the sincerity of leaving the movement. However, the last thing I will just note is that regardless of what they currently believe, it doesn't change the fact that they were part of this violent conspiracy 3 years ago. And regardless of their current beliefs, they still need to be held accountable for what they did. So as I mentioned, the best way to do that is to fully cooperate with our litigation.
Well, Karen, Robbie, and Amy, I want to ask one more question of you all, but before I ask it, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. The work you are doing is historic. If this is the beginning of the 21st century civil rights movement in America, this legal case will be one of the seminal fights in the birth of that new civil rights movement. I know it has taken its toll. I understand that legal suits are stressful, that you are looking and speaking to individuals whose very rhetoric is violent and carries an emotional burden. Tell us this, how can all of us who are listening right now, what can we do to support and to join this important moment?
Well, first of all, Eric, it's such a joy to get to do an event like this with you. I'm much like all of us, I think, frequently been on panels together, and I learn so much from you every time. And that includes now, even as a moderator, I feel like I still learn so much from you. And so we're just so lucky to have you as part of this fight. So thank you. And to all of the amazing sponsors of tonight's event. This is, I think, our biggest virtual event yet, and it's a testament to everyone's incredible efforts and the hunger that's out there to get involved in doing something right now. I think it's so easy to feel scared and helpless and angry. And what's unique about IFA in this case is that it provides a concrete, tangible way to do something at this moment. And so there's a number of things that folks can do to get involved. First, spread the word. The video that we showed at the beginning was released earlier today to mark the 3rd anniversary of the violence, which is tomorrow and Wednesday. Share that video on social media. On our website, you'll also find an activist toolkit and other materials that you could share to let people know that this case is happening and that there's a concrete way for them to get involved in the fight against violent white supremacy. If you can, donate. Every single dollar we raise directly supports this case, specifically the security, evidence collection, and other case costs that we described, again, security being by far the biggest line item in our budget for the reasons that we talked about. But also more broadly, and I know, Eric, you and many of our sponsors are tireless in this fight, don't let this issue fall off the radar. It's so easy after an attack happens, we talk about it for a few days, and then we move on. Violent white supremacy is one of the gravest threats to our communities, to our democracy, and to our national security. And until we start talking about it as such and treating it as such, the cycle is only going to continue. And so this case is critical. It can have impacts that extend well beyond Charlottesville, as we described, but it needs to be part of the much broader fight against the violent extremism that's been poisoning this country and that has been on the rise in recent years. So don't let this issue fall off the radar. Hold your elected officials accountable, hold the private sector accountable, and make your voices heard on this, because if we don't, it's only going to continue.
Thank you so much, Amy. And I want to thank Integrity First for America. I want to encourage everyone listening to understand that all those times we've wondered what we would have done in the 1960 civil rights movement, we no longer have to wonder. It is whatever we do when we end this call today. And I encourage people to make that first step in what you would do to support Integrity First for America and this legal campaign to hold the white supremacist movement accountable for its violence in Charlottesville. It is one clear way that we can all make a difference and make democracy count. It's a pledge that we can make to Integrity First for America, and it's a pledge that we make to one another this evening. Thank you all again. We want to share one final message with you all, and it is a pleasure to see everyone who is joined together tonight.
Thank you so much, Eric. You're such a hero of mine and of all of ours, because you've been doing this work for so many years.
Thank you so much for all you do. You make our work easier.
Yeah, I want to echo that. This has been phenomenal. And the one thing I also want to say is having so many people care about this case and be interested in all your questions, it's really heartening to us and enables us to keep going and, you know, push ahead with the work.
I want to also thank you all. This is Eileen Hershnoff, Senior Vice President for ADL. I am so privileged and honored, as is the ADL, to have supported both financially and with information Integrity First for America's suit, and to hold a seat on your board. Sorry, you're hearing the phone in the background. That's the Zoom thing. Thank you so much for that. I want to say a couple of things. I think Eric is so right. What we are seeing right now is the largest civil rights movement in at least 50 years, and this is part of it. When we march on the streets, when we do legislative work, regulatory, litigation, all of this reform, it matters. I want to say one thing very quickly that I saw recently that this case did to show you the tentacles of good that it can have. A little over a week ago, Twitter changed its rules on its platform to say that in getting rid of content and deplatforming hate groups and supremacists, they would look at what they did off the platform. That's a first, not just the content they said. And the first thing we did was point to some of the information that came from this case to get first David Duke and then some other folks deplatformed, and in getting information, we provided stuff that had come out from this lawsuit. So working to make the platforms modify is so important. This defunding these folks is so incredibly important. When you go after them, every time they get money, anytime they have a job, anytime anybody gives a donation to them, when you get a judgment, you can go after them. You can hound them, you can put them out of business. It doesn't matter if they don't have millions of dollars now, because those rulings will follow them forever. And the last thing I want to say is that we are facing now the kind of time when white supremacism surges. So doing the things that Amy mentioned are so important. We're seeing more and more ethno-national regimes, financial uncertainty and turmoil, the pandemic, hyperpolarization and partisanship, leadership saying there are very fine people on both sides. There are not. All of this is the kind of time that white supremacists, which are the groups that have killed more Americans than any other violent extremist groups, don't believe it's not Antifa. It is right-wing extremists and particularly white supremacists in this country. This is when they surge. What all of us can do to support this litigation and to speak up and to help those plaintiffs who are so brave, because they are on lists. I know because I see them in my organization, as are Robbie and Karen and Amy. So all of you, thank you for your bravery, and everyone else. Look forward to the next time we can talk to you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. We know you have our back, so thank you so much.